A very good morning to all of you. I welcome you all to the ICANN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. So, we will start today with the personality of the day. So, we will be talking about IAS officer Divya Devarajan. She is a 2010 batch IAS officer. Her story is very inspiring. She became the district collector of Adilabad in Telangana in 2017. So that time, as we know that Adilabad is a district that is dominated by the tribals, there was already violent clashes that were taking place among the tribals. So when she went there, she saw that the issue was very sensitive and she had to maturely handle it. And within 3 months after she went there as a TC, she appointed special tribal coordinators. She even appointed language translators in the government hospitals so that Gondi language was prominent there. So there is no problem with respect to accessing of healthcare facilities, so that she appointed language translators in government hospitals, and she made her own office more accessible to people, and she herself learnt the Gondi language. Bureaucrats before her also had made a lot of effort to learn the Gondi language, but they stopped after they learned the basics and the initial efforts. They had given up. But Divya Devarajan didn't do that, and she persisted. She learnt Gondi language and she was able to converse with the tribals in Gondi language itself. So, in fact, the people there used to tell that several collectors have come there before, and the only time the office of collector became accessible to people was during when Divya Madam was the DC there. And she also made sure that tribals trust her. So she organized, she kept Monday as a grievance redressal day. So she held grievance redressal sessions on Monday. And there she helped to solve several long pending disputes among the tribals, for instance, the land disputes or the land issues between the tribals. So she helped the settlement of these issues in the favor of the tribals. So all these she did, and she even created platforms for the tribals so that the tribals can sell their produce and they can have access to the minimum support price. So, and when she was about to go from there, the villagers were so much touched by her genuine efforts to provide facilities for them that they named an entire village in her name as Divya Guda. So this gesture shows the kind of impact she had left on the people and the gratitude of the people towards her for bringing a change in their lives. So this particular personality of the day, you can use it to show that how qualities like proactiveness, communication skills, quick grievance redressal of the citizens, and being in touch with the people, how it helps in genuine providing good governance to the citizens. It shows the role of civil services in tribal development. It shows the role of civil servants in bridging the gap of development and in reducing the trust deficit with the citizens. It also shows the importance of the officers being approachable and sensitive to the specific needs of the people in the district. It also shows the contribution of women in the civil services and how they make the societies better. And this is also an example of how people show gratitude for genuine administrators and appreciate their work. So, with this, we will start with the topics of the day. So we will start with the first topic of the day, which is India-China relations. So in this, we are going to be looking at two very important data for the exam. One is related to trade deficit and the other is related to the FDI. So one important problem that India had with China in the economic sphere is that we ran huge trade deficit with China, which means we were importing a lot from China, but our exports to China were less. So therefore we were running huge trade deficits. But the good thing is that this trade deficit is now declining, as you can see in the graph from 17-18. And also in the wake of the Galvin standoff now, we are aiming to reduce our economic dependence on China, and thereby we can predict that even in the future this trade deficit is going to further reduce. So in 17-18 this trade deficit was about $63 billion in 17-18, and then in 18-19 this became $53.5 billion, and then in 19-20 now it has become $48.6 billion. So you can use this pictographical representation to show our declining trade deficit with China. The second important data we'll be looking at is the FDI from China. So China was investing a lot through the foreign direct investment route in India, but now recently again India had restricted that FDI coming from countries which shares borders with India. So it has restricted those FDI. So this was particularly meant to target China in a way. So this FDI from China in 1819 we got is $229 million, and then now it has become $163.7 million. So the FDI foreign direct investment from China is also declining. So this shows the developments in the economic relations between the two countries. So now we will see the next aspect in India-China relations, which is decoupling from China. So decoupling means at present we are extremely dependent on China. So we have huge manufacturing imports that come from China. We are dependent on China for the active pharmaceutical ingredients imports. So India is the pharmacy of the third world, and we are the largest manufacturers of generic medicines. So for that, for manufacturing drugs, we need active pharmaceutical ingredients which act as raw materials for the manufacture of drugs. But we don't have this APIs itself, but we are manufacturing drugs on a large scale. So nearly 80% of the API we get it via imports, and out of this 70% of the imports is from China alone. So this shows our huge dependence on China when it comes to APIs for making drugs. So this is one area where government wants to decouple from China and then be able to self-reliantly manufacture APIs within India, so that our dependence on China is reduced. So in this regard, government has taken two important initiatives. One is the government has allocated 3,000 crore rupees to develop three bulk drug parks. So 3 bulk drug parks are going to be developed. For that, government has allocated 3,000 crores. And also government has allocated 6,900 crores, which will be spent over a period of 8 years to some 53 bulk drug manufacturers. So by using these methods, India is trying to achieve self-reliance in the API production capabilities, so that our dependence on China in this regard is reduced. So now we'll move on to the next article related to India-China. So when it comes to the economic relations between the two countries, there are two sectors which from where we get a huge amount of imports from China. One is the large manufacturing goods which are imported from China, large amount of the manufacturing goods, and the second is the information technology, which again is the services are imported from China. So as recently we can see that the 59 Chinese apps have been banned. So they had a huge user base in India. So information technology is another area where we are looking to reduce our dependence and reduce our relations with China. So in this regard, first we have to understand what had been India's strengths and what made China have its presence in the Indian digital space as it is having today. So India is one of the world's most connected economies, and our internet penetration is now reaching almost 1 billion, and the number of smartphone users have increased in the past couple of years. The number of smartphone users have been on an increase, and also through Startup India initiative, government is encouraging the startups, particularly in the digital space, so that they can deliver various digital services. And through the Digital India program, government is again encouraging the domestic manufacturing of various digital equipments and digital service delivery. So in this regard, it is because of these strengths that India serves as a very huge market for the Chinese IT sector. So all the equipments which are used in the manufacture of various digital equipments come from China, and China is also making a huge amount of investments in the Indian startups, and a large number of Chinese apps are now being used in India. And because India provides that market to China, it is a huge user base in India. So in this regard, what actions have been taken by China, or what China has done to increase its presence in the IT sector in India? First thing is that it has invested in various companies in India or which are dealing with the digital sector. So, for instance, Chinese investors have a major stake in 18 out of the top 30 unicorns in India. So, in 18 out of top 30 unicorns, China is having a major stake. And through this, it is exerting influence in the strategic part of our economy. And even if you look at the influence by the Chinese, that amounts to nearly just 3 billion. But however, in spite of a small investment, the influence that it is exerting in the strategic part of our economy is huge. The reason being our weak regulations. So, if we look at the privacy protection in India, that is poor, and the data protection regulations, so these are poor. So, there are no strict data regulations when it comes to collection of data by the Chinese apps, and these data being stored outside of India, maybe in China, in remote servers. So, because of these poor regulations related to privacy and the data regulation, the influence that the Chinese investments have had in the strategic part of our economy has been disproportionate compared to an investment of just $3 billion. And now China has started to fund and do its investment in various Indian startups. So, one data regarding this is that nearly just 2 dozen Chinese companies have funded nearly 92 Indian startups. So, that is a huge number. So, China is trying to enter through the startups itself by having major stakes in them and also by funding them. So, this is how China has been increasing its presence in India. And also, recently, it was felt that. Because of the pandemic, because of COVID crisis, many firms would be in that collapsing state. So because of that, their shares would fall, which China would buy, and then it would end up having major stake in those firms. So that was precisely the reason why government of India had restricted FDI. So now we have to understand, if this is the case of China's presence in the Indian digital space, then what should be the way forward? So, the first is we have to strengthen our regulations. Our privacy framework and our data protection framework has to be made more strong and robust. So, this is the first thing that we need to do. Second, we come to is a self-reliance vision. So now we are talking about the Atmanirbhar Bharat initiative, the packages which are being announced. So as a part of this, we must have a vision plan over what we should be doing in the digital space. So what kind of investments should be allowed, the startups, how they need to be encouraged, so that we can self-reliantly develop our digital space without any Chinese investments or imports from China. The third thing we need to do is to encourage the startups. We need to provide a conducive environment for the startups to grow in the digital space, because that is one of the most innovative and that is where India's strength also lies. So India needs to provide a very conducive environment for the growth of the startups. So the last is related to the funding. So most of the Indian startups today which have become successful, they have received funding from the foreign or overseas venture capital funds. So they didn't receive funding from any of the domestic venture capital funds. So if startups need to be encouraged, then funding is one of the most crucial aspects, and we need to work on this. And now many of the startups that China is funding it is being done because these startups are genuinely starved of funds. They have good ideas, but they are starved of funds. So we need to provide good flexible funding to these through domestic venture capital funds, so that they don't have to be dependent on investments from countries like China. So this is the four a basic plan that we should as a way forward do in order to reduce China's presence in the India's IT space. So next topic we'll be talking about is the custodial torture issue. So in this it was basically 3 and more articles on this custodial torture. So various points like why there is custodial torture that is still persisting in India. So points were dispersed across these 3 articles. I have collated them. So we will be looking at some 10 to 11 reasons as to why the custodial torture persists still in India. The first reason why torture exists, or custodial torture is there, is the confessions which are being used as evidence. So laws like the TADA that is the Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Prevention Act, then POTA, that is Prevention of Terrorist Activities Act. So these legislations, they accept confessions which are made in front of the police as an evidence in the court. So whatever the person is going to confess in front of the police, then that can be used as an evidence against the same person in the court. So this is making the police to somehow extract the confession from the person so that they can use it as an evidence in the court to make the case stronger. So this is leading them to use third degree brutal methods in order to extract confessions from the people who have been accused. So using of confessions as evidence and the law allowing that to do so is one reason why torture is there. Second is the technological upgradation which has been lacking. So usually the way investigations happen is by kind of using brutal methods to extract truth or confessions from people. But what should have actually happened is using technologies like DNA profiling and DNA fingerprinting, so that that can make the case more stronger and that can prove the guilt beyond any doubt. But because of poor technological upgradation among the police forces, because of that, the investigation has become very poor. So the only way to make the case stronger is by extracting the confession or truth from the accused. So because of the absence of such technological upgradation and using of these technologies to make the case stronger and to carry out investigation, it is torture in the prisons. The third reason is the absence of a people's movement. Now, what happened in USA, as we all saw, that the death of George Floyd, so that has led to a people's movement now. So people across the world are now coming on streets in support of the black people, and they are voicing out against these practices of racism and the evil of racism. So this whole movement of Black Lives Matter has been now launched, and people are voicing out their concerns against the same. But such people's movement is not happening in India, where there is no demand from the side of the people to end such torture in the prisons. So this demand from the people's side would have acted as a pressure on the legislators to come out with a stringent law against torture in the prisons. But this has not happened. So people are together, they can act as a pressure group on the government by demanding something. But such demand from the people's side has not been there. So this is another reason for the continuation of torture in the prisons. Next is underreporting. So NHRC data says that in the last 3 years, there have been 5,300 complaints that it has received related to custodial deaths. So, but NHRC also says that this itself is just the tip of the iceberg, and there is an underreporting of the cases. So 5,300 cases of custodial deaths being reported to NHRC in the last 3 years is just an underreporting. The actual number of cases are much, much higher. So police feel that they can easily get away even after torturing, and even after some custodial deaths, they can go scot-free and they need not even report the case about it to NHRC or anything. So such a feeling of impunity and such underreporting is again making many of the guilty police officials, they are going unpunished, and that is acting as a motivation to continue with the torture and yet not report the cases. The next reason for the torture to continue is a poor conviction rate. So in previous video we saw that according to government's own data, between 2000 to 2018, nearly 1,700 deaths have happened in the police custody according to government's own data. But in spite of 1,700 odd deaths, only 26 police officials have been convicted. So there is a poor conviction rate. So the police officials, they are not convicted for committing torture on the prison mates. So this is again leading to this culture or this feeling of impunity that they will go unpunished and nothing will happen to them. So this again is making them to torture the prison mates. The next reason is a burden of proof. So in this regard, Law Commission has suggested that if custodial death is happening, then the burden of proof should be on the police to prove that the death has happened not because of the police action, But this suggestion has still not been accepted by the government. So now the burden of proof actually lies on the prosecution itself, but not on the police. So the prosecution has the burden to prove that this death in the custody has happened because of police torture. But what Law Commission recommended was that if death has happened in the custody, then the police will have to prove that it was not because of the police torture. But this suggestion has not yet been accepted. So as the burden of proof lies on the prosecution to prove that the death happened because of police torture, this shifting of burden on the prosecution is leading to again poor conviction, because it is very difficult to prove that the death actually happened because of police torture. So that's another reason. The next reason is the absence of a legal framework. So we have already seen that India has signed but not ratified the United Nations Convention Against Torture, UNCAT, and also there is no law in India against torture. So several times both bills in the parliament and even the private member bills have been introduced, but they have lapsed and we still do not have any comprehensive legislation against torture. So this absence of legal framework is also one reason for the torture. Next is absence of independent inquiries. In fact, it is mandated by law that whenever a custodial death happens, then that has to be investigated by independent magisterial inquiries. But this is not happening. Only in 20% of the cases, independent magisterial inquiries are happened. Now, custodial deaths may be happening because of police torturing the accused. And then after the custodial death happened because of the police torture, the police is only investigating the case. So there is a clear case of conflict of interest here. The police may be involved in the torture which has led to custodial death, and the police are only investigating the case. So there is a conflict of interest and truth doesn't come out. So that is why it is mandated that independent magisterial inquiry should be conducted, but this is done only in 20% of the cases. So more often than not, when police inquiries are conducted against police own abuse of power, then it will just lead to hiding the dust, and then it doesn't the truth doesn't come out. Next reason is a poor prosecution. So the prosecution rate of the police officials who've been accused of police torture has also been very poor. This is because if a police official has to be prosecuted, it requires prior sanction of the government. Only when the government sanctions it, the police official can be prosecuted. So, and it is not easy to get the sanction of the government. So this is another reason that the police feel that either way the government is not going to give sanction so easily, so they will not be prosecuted. And again, this is related to the culture of impunity among the police officials. So another reason is a poor prosecution. Next is the attitude towards tolerance. So the editorial explains that we have developed a different attitude or different tolerance levels depending upon what the scenario was. For instance, in 2019, in the Hyderabad the police had killed 4 people who were accused in the Disha case. So here also they were tortured and the 4 people were killed by the police. But we celebrated this whole thing and we rather applauded the police personnel. Why? Because these 4 men were accused of raping and murdering brutally a woman. So that time we tolerated the police brutality and we even celebrated and lauded the police personnel, saying that these people deserved such a treatment because they have committed such a heinous and horrendous crime. But now what happened in Tamil Nadu, now we are saying that this police brutality should not be tolerated and this is extremely brutal and violent. So we need to take steps against custodial torture and all that. So our own attitude towards tolerance is very differential. While we welcome the police brutality in one crime, we are against it in another case. So that has become very subjective, but rather our attitude towards police brutality should have been the same, and there has to be a policy or an attitude of zero tolerance towards police brutality, whatever may be the case. Let law decide what punishment should be given to the accused, and such justice by the police themselves by showing such brutality, no matter what the crime is, no matter what the case is, that should not be tolerated. And the next for custodial torture is the colonial mentality. So this says that during the colonial period, whatever police that structure that the colonial British people established, that continues to exist even today. The colonial mindset which breeds brutality and violence and torture, that exists even today. And also, a survey was conducted by Common Cause, which is an NGO, and Center for Study of Developing Societies. So these two conducted a survey in which it was found that 14% of the police, they felt that it is, in fact, the Muslims have a very much, the category is very much a natural tendency to commit crimes, while 36% of the police, they felt that the Muslims are somewhat prone to committing crimes. So this shows the presence of a prejudicial mindset among the police when it comes to the Muslims or the tribals or the Dalits and other weaker sections. So this there is this prejudice which is already there present in them, that if it is a Muslim, then there is a feeling that more likely the person would have committed a crime, and therefore there is more likelihood of using torture against such a person. So this colonial mentality and the presence of this prejudice in the police personnel is another reason for torture. So we have clearly seen various reasons why custodial torture happens. So you can have a full-fledged question on this as to why judicial torture happens, so in which you can just write these 11 points. So now we'll just have a quick look at the judicial stand. In the judicial stand also, we have discussed before the DK Basu judgments. So in this we saw that it was a series of judgments which together gave some 20 commandments as what has to be done, what steps needs to be taken to reduce custodial torture. So this has already been seen, and one more important case that you can remember for the purpose of exam is Sheila Barse versus State of Maharashtra case, which happened in 1987. So it was in the Sheila Barse case that the court condemned cruelty and torture as violative of Article 21 of the Constitution. So this you can quote that Sheila Barse case, the court identified, the court held that cruelty and torture is violative of Article 21 of the Constitution. So this case law can be used in your So next we will be talking about plastic pollution. So we will see an important data related to exam. So this is a data of McKinsey. So McKinsey in its report in 2018, it quoted that the amount of plastic waste that is generated every year is 350 million tons. So 350 million tons of plastic waste is generated every year at the global level, but out of this only 16% gets recycled. So, and one more thing is, one way of representing your data is just to write it, but as I stress more on pictographical representation or trying more innovative ways to represent your answer, you can also represent this using a pie chart, that if this is the total waste generated, which is 350 million tons, you can show a small portion, which is 16%, is actually recycled, and the rest are being just dumped in the landfills or the oceans. So this way of representation you can use for representing this data. So this is an important data related to plastic pollution you have to remember. So WHO has now estimated that COVID crisis is again contributing to an increase in the plastic pollution. So in this regard, WHO has estimated that the planet is using about 89 million masks and 16 million gloves each month because of the COVID crisis. So this again is worsening the plastic pollution, and whatever in the past steps had been taken to reduce the production and consumption of plastic, that has been undone because of this now. So in this regard, The Guardian has also reported that you might find more masks in the ocean than jellyfish in the oceans today. So this was a comment or the report of The Guardian. So in this regard, we will look at a few of India's efforts that India has taken to reduce the plastic pollution. So India has the plastic waste management rules of 2016, and which was again upgraded and amended in 2018. And the next step that we had taken was plogging. So plogging had become very popular in India. So plogging means just collecting the plastic waste when one is jogging. This had become a very famous event on the Mamalapuram beach in Tamil Nadu. So this was another thing. And also in October 2019, whole India took the pledge of Swachhata Hi Seva. So under this campaign also, people from all walks of life, they collected the plastic waste wherever they saw it in their surroundings, and not just collected it, but with the help of the local authorities, they also even disposed it safely. They gave the plastic waste collected by them a safe disposal also under the Swachhata Hi Seva campaign. So these were some of the steps that was taken in India. So in this regard, let's look at some of the international examples. So in this, the one example is the BYO movement. This Bring Your Own was a movement that had started in Singapore in 2017. So in this, consumers were encouraged to bring their own utensils to restaurants so that the usage of plastic and the generation of plastic waste gets reduced. So this was one such event, that one such example at the international level. So and when we come to the present, usually this plastic pollution is looked at as an environmental problem, as plastic has been generated so much of waste, how to dispose and all that. But we must also try to look this as an economic opportunity, because finding the alternatives for plastic is also a sustainable business opportunity. So you can find one case study in Uganda. So even in exams, you can just make these boxes and quote your case studies. So that will make it more obvious to the evaluator that you have written something different. So in Uganda, what they have done is they have melted the plastic, and from this they are making face shields. So these face shields are then being sold for less than $1. So this shows how the waste, a non-biodegradable waste of plastic that has been generated, can be melted again and reused to make face shields, which is very important during the corona crisis. So this itself is a business opportunity. You can also quote examples where the plastic has been melted and the pellets of plastic are being used for making road. So for road construction, in the road construction also, the plastic is being made use of. So this again is an economic opportunity. So like that, we need to find out sustainable business models where finding alternatives to plastic and innovative ways to find a safe disposal of the plastic itself can become an economic opportunity. So in this regard, we have to follow a 5S formula as the way forward. So the first thing would be to refuse. So as much as possible, we must try to refuse the use of plastic. Where it is not possible, at least reduce. And then where you're using it, try to reuse, stop using single-use plastic. And whatever we are using, try to recycle and try to increase the life of the plastic before it can go to the landfill. And finally, when it is not possible, remove. Whenever you have to dispose the plastic, that is remove the plastic, then it has to be done in a safe and effective manner. So safe disposal of plastic is again very important. Just by dumping it in the ocean will also lead to marine pollution and various other environmental issues. So safe and effective removal of the plastic is also important. So this 5R formula, and the 5R formula has to be used that should be the ultimate vision, that should be the way forward. So now we will look at the next topic, which is privatization in railways. So in this regard, the recent news is that the Indian Railways has decided that it is going to allow some private firms to operate in the passenger segment. So in this, 151 new trains will be there, and these trains will be used by the private firms for operating on the passenger routes. So why this is important is because railways had been the government monopoly in the past, and this is the first time that the government is allowing the participation of private sector in the passenger segment. So in this regard, in this way, it is very significant. So however, there will be few critical issues which we will need to face. The first thing is the financial viability. So if we look at the railways now, there is what is called as a cross subsidization. So this cross subsidization means that the passenger fares are kept low and the freight charges are kept high, so that the freight is going to cross subsidize the passenger fare. But for the private sector to be financially viable, it cannot keep the train fares so low, because that cross subsidization option for the private sector is not possible. So it has to keep the fares little bit higher. So first thing is, if it keeps the fare low, then it is not going to be financially viable. But if it keeps the fare high, then the problem it will lead to is that the fares will become very close to the air fares. So if the train fare is 2000, if the airfare is just 2500, for a 500 rupees margin, I would definitely choose the air route because that is going to help me reach the destination much faster. So then airways is going to throw these private sector railway firms out of the market if the fares of the railway sector is kept high. So therefore the financial viability will be one important critical issue. The second issue would be related to the regulator. So already private sector is operating in the container traffic. So the container trains experience of the private sector operating there suggests that we need an independent regulator. So this independent regulator will only be able to provide a level playing field. So the private sector needs to be given this level playing field. So for that we need an independent regulator. But if you look at the current regulator, the same entity is responsible for making the policy, for regulating, as well as providing the service, everything rolled into one. So this is a clear case of conflict of interest, as was told by the Bibek-Debroy committee. So therefore, it shows that we need an independent regulator so that private sector can be provided a level playing field with, and we can also establish the trust with the private sector. So in this regard, why I have written these two words in the boxes? In the answer, many of you might be writing Bibek-Debroy committee had told that we need to have an independent regulator, otherwise there will be conflict of interest. But these are important keywords which you need to underline in your answer. So underlining in your answer the important keywords is very important part of answer writing. So when you are writing Bibek-Debroy committee, you have to underline Bibek-Debroy, and when you're writing such keywords like conflict of interest, decoupling with China, or anything like that, any important keywords, you have to underline them so that the evaluator's attention can quickly go to it, and he or she knows that you are on this right track, and then it will be easy for him or her to go through and quickly browse through your answer. So now we will go to the there is this international scenario also in this, that another committee called as the Rakesh Mohan committee. So Rakesh Mohan committee report, when it pointed out that in several other countries also this privatization experience was done. So privatizing the railway in an international experience, it was found that it was difficult and it was also controversial. So therefore India should adopt a very measured approach in this regard. It should keep in mind the social welfare concerns of the railways on the one hand, and while allowing the private sector, it should also have that flexibility in the framework, so that if and when it is required tomorrow, it can fine tune these regulatory framework and the rules related to it. So the framework should be kept flexible, and the private sector should be allowed to operate in a flexible manner, and this framework we should be able to fine tune in the future. And we should also keep in mind the social welfare concerns. So in here again, you should quote and underline Rakesh Mohan committee. So the next topic we'll come to is the issues related to judiciary. So the issue that was discussed in in this editorial was the proceedings of the court, the higher courts and the Supreme Court and the High Courts should be broadcast live. So the arguments were presented in favor of why the court proceedings should be broadcast live. See the judicial stand, what judiciary has to say about broadcasting its own proceedings. So in this, the case law that you have to mention is the Swapnil Tripathi versus the Supreme Court of India. So in this, the court recommended that the proceedings in the Supreme Court should be broadcast live. So this was the Supreme Court's stand itself in Swapnil Tripathi case, that was in 2018. So next, the ex-CJI of India, Deepak Mishra, had also commented that this live streaming of the proceedings is actually a part of access to justice that comes under Article 21. So Article 21 has been widely interpreted, and it includes access to justice also. So, or the right to justice. So under this right to justice, only the live streaming of the proceedings will also come. So this was the comment of the ex-CJI Deepak Mishra. So this also you can quote that is why the live streaming is very important, as it is part of Article 21 right to justice. And in this regard, first we will Attorney General had also made one very important suggestion in this regard. So he said that live streaming of cases is very important, and that has to be done for constitutional cases and cases which are of national importance, as a pilot project, we can start for these. So we can live stream these projects, the constitutional bench, whatever cases it takes up, the constitutional cases and the national importance cases, so they should be live streamed. But if it is of any personal issues like any matrimonial issues or some issues which are related to the national security, these should be excluded. So these cases should not be live streamed. So this was a suggestion of the Attorney General. So this can be written as a part of way forward, that we can start a pilot project where we can broadcast the constitutional cases and national importance as a pilot project. But if it relates to matrimonial cases or other personal cases and national security, then we don't have to broadcast. So another important thing is the Justice D.Y. Chandrachud's remark. So he says that live streaming of the cases will actually foster public confidence in the judiciary. So again, this is one of the arguments that is given in favor of broadcasting the proceedings, because when public see what happens in the court, their confidence and their trust in the judiciary is going to increase, that judiciary is the arbiter of the issues and it is the interpreter of constitution and it is going to protect the rights and freedoms of the people. So public confidence in judiciary is going to be fostered when the live streaming or broadcasting is done of the proceeding. So then we'll come to the international example. In Australia, the proceedings are recorded and then posted. So they are not live streamed, but they are recorded and then they are posted on the High Court's website. So this is the practice in Australia. In the United States, the video recording is not allowed, but the oral arguments are recorded. So the entire transcript is then made to be available publicly. So in United States, though recording doesn't happen, but the entire transcript will be put in the public domain. And when it comes to countries like Brazil, Canada and Germany, in these countries the proceedings are broadcast live. So live broadcasting of the sessions of the proceedings happen in these days. So then why broadcast? We have already seen that why we need to broadcast. One reason is that it will increase the public confidence and trust in the judiciary. Another reason is that many of the judicial judgments actually act as a turning point in the life of the nation. So some of the Supreme Court judgments like the Ayodhya, the Aadhaar one, then Article 377, then NRC, the Triple Talaq judgments. So all of these are those important crucial judgments which have changed the lives of several citizens. So therefore, it is because these judgments have such wide-ranging implications on the lives of people, it's very important that the people should themselves know what exactly is happening during the proceedings. So that is why it's important to broadcast. The second is a contribution of legal stalwarts. There are legal stalwarts like Ram Jethmalani, Ashok Desai. So the kind of arguments they would have given in the court, so it is actually an asset for the future generations to go through this recording and learn a lot from that. So their contribution we need to record using. That can happen only when we keep a record of whatever proceeding is happening in the court, and this is another reason why we need to broadcast. The third reason, as we have already discussed, is inspiring public confidence in the judiciary. The fourth reason is it acts as a very important source for the journalists, the civil society activists, and even the academia also. So journalists will know the clear things clearly, what is happening in the court and what is the stand of the judiciary, what is the stand of the government. Everything the journalists will know, so they can make a true and fair reporting in the media. The civil society activists again will know clearly what's happening, what their demands were, what the court's arguments are. So based on that, it helps them in fighting a particular cause. So civil society activists also, similarly academia. So all of these people are going to be helped a lot if the court cases are live streamed. So it is because of all these reasons that we need to broadcast the proceedings, and this documentation is very essential to for our own future, that we can look back, we can have some precedents. So this documentation is very important. So the last topic we'll be discussing for today is a defense preparedness. This is just factual information that India has now cleared a deal of 38,900 crore worth. So this much of defense deal has been cleared by the Defense Acquisition Council. So in this comes a deal for 21 MiG-29, fighter jets. So MiG-29 fighter jets are there, and then HAL will be manufacturing the Sukhoi Sukhoi 30 MKI. So HAL will be manufacturing that, and then the deal also includes the Pinaka. So Pinaka is a flight artillery rocket system, so that is there included in the deal. And then it also includes the Astra. Astra is a air-to-air missile. So this is developed and designed by DRDO. So the deal also includes Astra. So all of these shows the various measures the government is undertaking to make its defense preparedness more robust given the India-China border conflict. So now government is taking more quicker steps in order to improve its defense preparedness. And so today's question will be privatization of railways. What are the arguments for and against it? So it is a 10-marker question for 150 words. These are very common questions, and that is where lack of preparedness will make a difference between you and any other aspirant. So for these standard type of questions, you must always keep your answers ready so that there is no need to even think for a second during the exam. As soon as you see the question, you can start writing your answer. So for these kind of questions, you can prepare well. So do write the answer. That's it for today. Thank you.